Okay. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Women's Policy Group Feminist Recovery Plan webinar series. My name is Rachel Powell and I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency in Belfast. So today's webinar is going to focus on providing a global outlook to how COVID-19 has impacted social justice and gender equality, particularly looking at areas that have been impacted by conflict. So this event is being hosted in collaboration with the Women's Resource and Development Agency and the Social Change Initiative. And before we begin, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview about what the Women's Policy Group is and how the Feminist Recovery Plan came to exist, really. So many of you will already know this, but the Women's Policy Group is a group of women working in policy roles across Northern Ireland. We have representatives from the women's sector, LGBT groups, trade unions, human rights, migrant rights, campaigning, feminist and advocacy roles that attend each meeting and work collaboratively with us. We do a range of policy work through responding to consultations, submitting evidence, publishing briefings and the whole works. So once COVID hit, immediately we were faced with our biggest challenge, I would say, that we've had in the group in recent years. So given the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women globally, the Women's Policy Group spent a significant amount of time from the very beginning of the pandemic calling on elected representatives to mitigate against the disproportionate impact it was having on women. So this involved creating briefings, articles, publishing statements, submitting evidence to both the NI executive and Westminster governments. As the months went on, we still found that little to no reference to the disproportionate impact the pandemic was having on women was being mentioned. Even where groups were being set up by the government to respond to the pandemic, we were consistently left out and had to fight for our spaces to be able to represent the needs of women. We do know that the ongoing pandemic has created an unprecedented challenge, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the world. It has put a sharp focus on the value and importance of care work, both paid and unpaid, and highlighted the essential and often precarious nature and almost always low paid retail and hospitality work, which is done overwhelmingly by women. Women undertake the majority of this work, and we already have seen that they are bearing the brunt of this crisis economically, socially, and in terms of health. And the Women's Policy Group consistently called on decision makers across the UK to take action to ensure a gender-sensitive crisis response as we transition from responding to the crisis and to recovery afterwards. So, as I said, the current crisis impacts men and women differently, and in many cases, it has been seen to deepen the inequalities that women already experienced on an everyday basis. These inequalities, along with what we see as key solutions, were highlighted in our Women's Manifesto in preparation for the general election back in December 2019, which already seems like it was about a decade ago. So we had already created different pillars at looking at the different issues and provided solutions central for a long-term response. In particular, in relation to COVID, we raised issues relating to gender segregation in our labour markets, including the fact that over 70% of health and social care workers are women, that the majority of both paid and unpaid carers are women, that 85% of part-time workers, 70% of those ineligible for statutory sick pay were all women in Northern Ireland. We consistently raised our concerns over increased domestic violence, the lack of access to childcare, and other areas as well, such as furloughed women losing their right to their statutory maternity pay. And we did see some small gains along the way. However, the disproportionate impact of COVID on women in Northern Ireland was still largely ignored by our elected representatives. So we decided then to create a roadmap to enable policymakers to not only mitigate against the impact on women, but to alleviate the pre-existing inequalities as we recover from the impacts of the pandemic. So really that was how the Feminist Recovery Plan came into place. And many of you will know it's an extremely comprehensive document with 127 pages and was written by about 18 organisations collaboratively using their own areas of expertise. But for the purpose of this webinar, what I wanted to raise was that Sorry, can I just ask everyone to mute as well if you're not speaking at the minute? There's just a bit of an echo. So yes, the purpose of this webinar today was to look at the global experience and global solutions to this global pandemic. We sometimes in Northern Ireland tend to look at Northern Ireland in a bubble. And I think that this is a really important opportunity for us to learn from women elsewhere who are also dealing with similar issues in areas that are either currently impacted by conflict or they have been in the recent past. Because we do know that areas impacted by conflict have additional barriers for women. And as the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security is next weekend, we decided that this event would look at these additional barriers in conflict and post-conflict settings. We specifically want to look at the relationship between women's participation, which is one of the key pillars of 1325, and how this is key to resolving issues of increased gender inequality due to COVID-19. So today's webinar is going to involve speeches from 4 of our speakers. So some of them are here at the minute and some are going to join us slightly later. And following that, we'll have a short question and answer series before the end. But I just wanted to introduce our speakers for you today. So first of all, providing the context of the history of Northern Ireland women's participation, we have Avala Kilmurray. So Avala has worked within communities in Northern Ireland since 1975. She was a founding member of Foyle Women's Aid, the first coordinator of the Northern Ireland Women's Aid Federation, an active member of the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, and the first ever women's officer for the ATGWU, which is now Unite the Union in Ireland. Avala worked with the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action and was later the director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland from 1994 to 2014. Over her time in the Community Foundation, she managed EU peace funds for community-based peace building, as well as to support the reintegration of political ex-prisoners and victims and survivors of violence. Avala was a founding member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition in 1996 and served on the negotiating team of the Coalition for the Good Friday Agreement. She's written extensively on both community action and peace building. Avala is also currently working with the Social Change Initiative to support activism and advocacy in the areas of peace building and refugee/migration issues. She is the author of a recent book named Community Action in a Contested Society, The Story of Northern Ireland. So I'm going to hand it over to Avala now to talk to you all for the next few minutes. Thank you, Avala.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'm delighted to be here. Because of time, I apologise in advance if I'm only sharing some personal perspectives on the history of the women's movement here, because clearly, despite the sort of the troubles and all the political developments, it was a very important movement and took very many different forms. But I suppose my first point to make is that violence tends to squeeze out important issues, particularly issues relating to women. And actually thinking back, to when we set up the Women's Aid Refuge in Derry in 1977, we were told it wasn't needed, that there was no such thing about domestic violence. So that we had to actually occupy illegally a building to open it. And in the first year, we had 100 women and 300 children through it. But again, it just shows, that people's were so fixed on the consequences of the troubles that something as important as domestic violence went almost unnoticed. And similarly, looking back, all the campaigns around that time for divorce legislation, and really trying to update the legislation in what, from all sides of the community in Northern Ireland, is a very conservative society. But the other important aspect I think is worth mentioning is the community-based women's movement, which was there, but particularly came to the fore in the 1980s, which was a fairly awful decade, looking back in terms of the austerity of the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, allied to the ongoing hemorrhage of the violence. But we had got the Women's Centre starting in local communities. We had got networking between them. We had the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement arguing for aspects of women's rights that really had come out of the Beijing conference back in the early on. And then we also had things like the Women's Information Day group, which actually brought together women from their own areas, many of them, most of them, single identity areas, together to look at issues on a cross-community basis on the last Friday of every single month. And I think one of the things we learned from that in conflict, what can help is actually bringing women together on priorities that they identify. And most of them were about poverty, how to actually, get the money to buy a school uniform. And I think from that, we identified the importance of what we called politics with a little p as against politics with a big P. Politics was a big P, was always the sort of the constitutional issue. But what it did do was it broke down stereotypes, because when people are divided, it is all too easy to actually sort of to think of the other in sort of very derogatory terms. And then the other thing that we saw happening during that period was the use of social justice issues to actually mobilize women. So in the trade union movement, for argument's sake, we brought together women from right across communities in Northern Ireland on issues of low pay. But also we learned from there the use of looking at divisive issues through the prism of principles. So for argument's sake, when very potentially sensitive issues came up, such as strip searching of women in Armagh prison, we were able to actually get women from a range of communities to discuss that issue because we talked about human rights and started from the premise of human rights and then looked at issues that otherwise would have been seen as a zero-sum game. And that approach was brought into the Women's Coalition when it was set up in 1996. It had three principles: human rights, equality, and inclusion. Inclusion in that it would talk to everybody, irrespective of what their background was or their perspective. And the other thing I think that we learned from that was the importance of modeling organizations in a divided society where people can actually see themselves reflected in the organization. So we had two co-leadership. We had Monica McWilliams from Catholic nationalist background. We had Pearl Sager and afterwards Jane Morris from a Protestant Unionist background. So we were able to look at issues in many ways through the eyes and voice of the perceived other. But the experience of the peace talks for me highlighted a number of things. First of all, the narrowness of our party politics and the fact that party politics, and not just in Northern Ireland, though it's particularly narrowed with conflict, it has become almost like a career structure. And if you fall from outside that, people, particularly men, don't see it as acceptable for other people to raise their voices in terms of politics. We also found the power of the media and of middle management officials who again had very narrow views of what was political and what was politics. I mean, we used to always get telephone calls from journalists saying, "Can we speak to your leader?" And we'd say, "Which one?" or both. And they just couldn't get their heads around it. Then we also found the importance of understanding the technicalities of how things work. Whenever you're drawing up a peace agreement, you need to understand how it is framed in order to get your messages into it. And we took a while to actually do that. And I suppose the other two things that we found were the importance of following things through. And we made a mistake here. We got the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, whatever you want to call it, but we didn't spend any time looking at the implementation and the accountability mechanisms. So important aspects like the Civic Forum, like the Bill of Rights, have essentially been sidelined, and we weren't able to deliver on them after the agreement itself. And the other thing that underpins all that was the importance of building connections and relationships. So in conclusion then, just perhaps 4 lessons learned. First of all, the need to analyze what is achievable in the short term, as well as looking towards the longer term. And looking back to the Good Friday Agreement, it was important to have the homework done, like you've been doing with the feminist plan, to actually sort of use the opportunity to get suggestions and recommendations in when there was a short-term opportunity. But actually, in the longer term, it is an understanding of social justice. What type of society do we want to live on that puts flesh on the short-term demands? Secondly, the need to build alliances around and across our divisions, because we can just so often become captive of our own bubbles of understanding and connection. And indeed, we can also be engaged in sort of almost burnout activism. The need to get beyond that to understand other people's perspectives. And then the importance of linking social justice and peace building to avoid the simplification of violence, or the simplification that political orthodoxy imposes. The sense that it's a zero-sum game, a win for them is a loss for us, or you're either a disciple or a traitor. I think linking social justice and peace building allows a more nuanced approach that's more inclusive. And last, to beware, and I think even in terms of 1325, to get beyond the actual words written on the page, and to beware of the buried assumptions, the damaging stereotypes, and the presumptions that really sort of are what actually maintains the current institutionalized approach. This feeling that, oh, well, things have always been like this, and this is the way they're done. To actually try and transform things, I think we need to try and explode that. So perhaps if I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Avila, and definitely cannot be underestimated the amount of work that went on for women's movements in that time. And it certainly enables women like me to be able to do the work that I do today. It wouldn't have been possible without you. So thank you very much for that overview. And on that note, I'm going to ask our next speaker then, Elaine Crory, to talk a bit more about the modern day issues with women peace building and some of the aspects of the feminist recovery plan relating to social justice. So Elaine Crory works with the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and she is our Good Relations Coordinator. She works with communities across Northern Ireland to deliver community relations programs with a gender perspective to groups of women from all backgrounds. Elaine also works on the Raise Your Voice programme to tackle sexual harassment and violence in the community, and she also teaches history and politics to adult learners. So I'd like to hand it over to Elaine next, please.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And just to reiterate what you said there, the work that we're doing now would not be possible without the work that people like Avila and others did before us. It's very much inspirational, really, in terms of how we go about our work on a day-to-day basis. As Rachel has said there, my day job is going to communities across Northern Ireland, communities of women, and talking to them about issues around community relations, peace building, social justice, and so on. As Rachel also said, my background is in teaching, and I still do some of that. And I had to learn when I started this job that actually there's very little I can teach these women. The best thing to do is to ask the right questions and to listen to what they say. And really, they're doing more of the teaching than I am. Alongside other organizations that do work directly with these women in these community groups, we're learning so much about the picture on the ground that our job really is then to turn that into policy documents and so on. But the ideas are already there. We don't need to put them in people's heads. We just need to coax them out. One of the things that's really striking about when I go out and talk to these women is they are experts, not in the formal sense, but they're experts by experience. I think that's a phrase that I've heard the Women's Support Network use regarding these issues, and it's absolutely perfect. They don't necessarily know about the goings on at the United Nations. They wouldn't recognize 1325 by name, but the spirit of it is intuitively obvious to them. They have been living this for decades, and they have been doing the difficult cross-community conversations for decades. So what's also obvious to them as a result of this process is that cooperation and compromise and understanding the other perspective is vital to understanding the issues that are at hand, whether they are old issues or whether they are new issues. And so when I talk to these women, and I have met some of them in person since the pandemic started, and others online. Some of these are women I already know because I worked with them last year, the previous year, or whatever. Some of them are relatively new to me, but what they are saying is what they have said before, but with a renewed kind of sharpened focus because of the pandemic. The pandemic has moved everything up in terms of urgency, but the same issues are already there. So it goes to what we are saying in the recovery plan, that a lot of these issues that women were experiencing already, that were clear and present issues for them, are now in more sharpened focus because of the pandemic. It's funny because we always try to, like I said, come up with some conclusions, some neat conclusions at the end of a program. You know, what are the recommendations? And it's striking to me that whether I'm talking to women in a very specific local area in, say, North Belfast, or whether I'm talking to women from diverse places across Northern Ireland, from rural to urban, from single identity to mixed identity, to migrant women who've been here a little while and sort of gotten used to the circumstances here. The recommendations, the learning that they have to give me is very often very, very similar. It's very slightly depending on location. You know, groups in Fermanagh will have more urgent concerns about the border, for example, in the context of Brexit. They will be more concerned about the access to transport, whereas urban groups won't necessarily have that at the top of their mind, but it's somewhere in there. And these things come up again and again. They have very clear ideas about what needs to be done to move this place forward. They have very clear ideas about what the social justice issues are and how urgent they are. What they don't have is faith that the political leaders that we do have are going to solve the problem or have any real intention to solve the problem. And one of the things that can make you feel a little, I suppose, despondent about the future of this place, that has come up, it's mentioned in the recovery plan, but it's come up again and again, is the coercive control that many of these communities are under because of ongoing paramilitarism. So a lot of the issues that are happening on a wider scale than just Northern Ireland. For example, poverty is top of the list. The feeling that it's virtually impossible to make ends meet and put food on the table and pay the bills, let alone actually lift themselves as individuals or as a community out of poverty. And there is a sharp sense that this is a deliberate choice. This is a result directly of policies that are made over in London without any concern for the communities here. And whether it's single identity work or not, the women are telling me that they don't think it's any different for the ones on the other side, so to speak. They're very acutely aware that whether you're in a fairly exclusively nationalist or unionist community, the issues are the same on the other side, and that they have as much in common on these issues as they do, dividing them probably more so. And as this goes on, this poverty is exacerbated and also taken advantage of by the paramilitaries that continue to exist. And I say paramilitaries because that's what the newspapers would call them. But these women tell me again and again, they aren't paramilitaries. They are gangsters. They liken them to the mafia or to a drug dealing gang, because to them, that's exactly what they're doing. They're taking advantage of mental health crisis, which I'll come on to in a moment, to and also at the same time making it worse, because the debt, the worries, the loan sharking that these people engage in is putting additional pressure on families already struggling in terms of poverty. So you've got the sort of double whammy of government policies that leave people in poverty, and then paramilitaries, in quotation marks, who take advantage of that and make it worse. And that collides with the existing mental health issues, which no matter where I go, that is, if not issue number one, it's issue number two for all of these women. They are concerned not necessarily even about their own mental health, but about the mental health of their children and grandchildren. And they're all very acutely aware that the long shadow of the past is still being cast on those children who weren't even born at the time of the conflict, but are still living with both intergenerational trauma, but also the feeling that the poverty of this place, the general lack of opportunities, will either lead to their children and grandchildren packing up and leaving, or giving up, or falling to addiction or depression, or both. and that the paramilitaries are sitting around like vultures waiting for that to happen so that they can reap as much money as they possibly can. And when they look at politics with a big P, as Avila put it, they don't feel a lot of hope. They feel like those people in power, overwhelmingly, the majority of them, want to keep things as they are because it ensures their positions of power and strength. And they feel like no matter how often they say these things, they've been saying them since the 70s, they continue to say them to this day in perhaps different language, but with the same sentiments. And they feel like it's not the case that they're being deliberately, so to speak, kept away from the table. It's that people are not listening. They're hearing what they say and choosing to put it to one side. One of the things that strikes me is so many of these women are active in their communities, trying to do what they can to help alleviate the stress, the poverty, the mental health issues. They're producing boundless numbers of recommendations. You know, they've got suggestions as to how these things could work. They're looking at organizations like the organizations who put together the Feminist Recovery Plan, but also like community organizations, like groups like PPR. They're looking at these things and saying, they've got suggestions, they've got solutions. Why is it that they're not being acted on? And they're coming to the conclusion again and again that they aren't being acted on because it's not that they aren't, the powers that be aren't aware of what the issues are and what the potential solutions are. It's because it suits everybody to keep things as they are. And oftentimes when they talk about women's involvement in peace building and so on, the solution that gets wheeled out is give them some confidence building classes. That's what they need. They need to feel like they, you know, they can speak in public and, you know, they know the right words and so on. That's not what these women's perception is. And indeed, it's not what my view is. It seems to me that these women have confidence. What they don't have is an opportunity to speak into the microphone, so to speak. Their concerns aren't being listened to and taken seriously for what they are worth. So again, I go back to my initial point, these women are experts. Their views are, we try to capture them, we try to turn them into policy documents, and then we try and get that listened to that way via the more formal understanding of expertise. But the expertise is there already. Sometimes I think it feels like that shadow of the past is inescapable to these women. It's a grim thought to end on. But what it seems more than anything else is that instead of allowing that shadow to engulf these communities, it's really our responsibility to try and learn from what's worked elsewhere to try and alleviate that shadow. Because although 1325 is not officially adopted here in Northern Ireland because it apparently wasn't a conflict, the spirit of it can be enacted. And that's what we are trying to do with the Feminist Recovery Plan. That's what so many organizations are working, paddling frantically to try and do all of the time. So I think the best thing that we can do to honor these women who've given so much of their time and energy to try and talk about these issues, despite feeling that they're not being listened to, is take those recommendations, turn them into something positive. And that's what I hope that the recovery plan is doing. In light of COVID, remember COVID hit us 2 months after New Decade, New Approach came out. New Decade, New Approach doesn't mention women once, not once. It's as if they forgot that 50-something% of the population are here. So COVID comes along and it impacts women even more, and you know, it doesn't seem to involve, all of the immediate actions don't seem to involve a recognition that has hit women more. And when I mention this to the women I speak to, they kind of roll their eyes like, well, of course it doesn't. They're not listening. Our job, like I said, is to make sure that they listen through whatever actions we can take. So really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers about what has worked and what could work elsewhere as we push on, trying to get some sort of positive change here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Elaine. And again, the work that Elaine does is absolutely incredible in Northern Ireland and reaches so many women in Northern Ireland to facilitate these sort of discussions. And that really was the point of the Feminist Recovery Plan, was to use these women's experiences and voices to try and achieve change in Northern Ireland, because women are experts in what they need to help them. So as you just said, Elaine, as well, in New Decade, New Approach. So for anyone that's joining us from outside of Northern Ireland, our government had collapsed for 3 years and it got back up again in January, and they had this new agreement signed by both the British government and Irish government as well. And it was called New Decade, New Approach, and set out what they were going to do now that they were back together again, essentially. And again, not once did it mention women at all in any part of the whole document. It mentioned gender once in terms of talking about creating a gender strategy, which has been out of date since 2016. And we are pleased to see that work is beginning on that. But it is worth noting in the context of COVID and peace building, particularly, and the impact of these additional barriers that women face. When we look at the National Action Plan for the UK government on dealing with women, peace and security, there is no reference to Northern Ireland at all. The Irish National Action Plan does have a reference to Northern Ireland, but again, we're talking about some of the most marginalised groups of women who aren't going to be able to access the Department of Foreign Affairs or Irish government on a regular basis. So we really do need to start having a more open avenue of advocating for ourselves and to really break down the barriers that exist due to the conflict in Northern Ireland. And on that note, bringing us in on our first look of a global outlook, I would like to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker from South Africa is Noma Masiko Mpaka. Noma is a feminist peace advocate and human rights advocate. Her professional work in the civil society space and development sector, spanning nearly a decade, lies in the interface between gender, human rights, women, peace and security, and transitional justice projects as they occur in conflict and post-conflict societies. Noma is the Gender, Human Rights and Human Security Programme Manager at the Embassy of Ireland in South Africa, where she provides policy support and analysis of gender, human rights and human security issues and trends in South Africa and the Southern Africa region. In this role, she is also responsible for programme and grant managing the development cooperation budget of the Embassy. Previously, Noma was a Senior Advocacy Officer at the Centre for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Cape Town. She has worked for organizations such as the Institute for Security Studies, the Centre for Conflict Resolution, and the African Leadership Centre, and the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Noma holds a Bachelor and Social Science degree with majors in Political Science and Public Policy Administration from the University of Cape Town. She also holds 2 master's degrees, a Master of Arts degree in International Relations with specialization in Global Political Economy and Conflict Dynamics from Stellenbosch University, as well as a Master of Science degree in Security, Leadership and Society from King's College London. Between advocating for durable peace, human rights and gender equality in Africa, Noma also enjoys the laughs and cuddles of her energetic 13-month-old son, Amani. So I would like then to hand over to Noma to speak to the rest of you now. Thank you, Noma.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and good afternoon, colleagues. So yeah, I've been tasked with just sharing our experience of the impact of COVID-19 on gender equality and social justice in South Africa. And I suppose in South Africa, we cannot ignore the economic, social, and structural issues which existed before COVID-19 and which exist currently right now as we're experiencing the pandemic, and certainly issues that will be exacerbated after the pandemic. And here we're talking about, of course, issues of a very unequal society, as many of you may know, South Africa being one of the most unequal society after I think Brazil, we're the most unequal society in the world. The issues of racial tensions in the country, if we look at our history of apartheid, colonialism, racism, and the rest of it, we still have a lot of issues around racial tensions. Of course, the issues of GBV. At some point, I think Interpol dubbed us the rape capital of the world. So we have really, really high issues of gender-based violence and femicide. We have your issues of xenophobia, your high unemployment. I think right now it sits at around 39%. Some arguing that it's actually closer to 50%, with young people, of course, being particularly unemployed in the country. And of course, your poverty and issues of violent crime. So when we're thinking about all these economic, social, and structural issues, of course, we know these were issues we had way before COVID came in, and COVID, all that COVID is doing is just really bringing it to the fore. Yeah, and so I think really this COVID-19 moment really is just a continuation of gender inequality in the country, of issues of patriarchy and toxic masculinity in the country. And you know, I mean, I'm sure it's pretty much the same. And I know earlier on I had a conversation with other colleagues, actually also from Northern Ireland, a little bit earlier in the morning, kind of also sharing experiences of 1325 and other peace building and kind of gender equality issues. And what was interesting for me is to kind of draw parallels between the two countries and seeing that actually, even though we're, you know, thousands and thousands of miles away, but there's so many similarities in the ways in which our elected officials have dealt with COVID-19 as far as its impact on women. And really the majority of the decision makers in the process of designing and executing the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions, regulations, and other responses have been men. And of course, it is not surprising, you know, that it's not surprising given the fact, of course, that women still do not enjoy the same degree of participation in the majority of decision-making processes and bodies. So what happened then in South Africa, of course, is that in planning all these lockdown restrictions, there was absolutely no gendered consideration or gendered analyses. Women's voices, their needs, their priorities, their contributions, their realities, their experiences were completely ignored. Interestingly, our Minister of Social Development admitted that she never imagined that the pandemic and lockdown of the economy would have such a devastating impact on the poor and vulnerable and those forced to live on the margins of society. So we found that completely outrageous that, you know, the Minister of Social Development could not foresee, you know, the impacts of a lockdown, of an economic lockdown. I mean, for us, for me anyway, personally, it's such a basic, you know, reality, right? And so for me, I wonder, so if they did not foresee that an economic lockdown would lead to these economic consequences, certainly they would not see the social impact on women that we'd see from the economic lockdown or the social lockdown. And so we see the ways in which, of course, lockdown impacted on women, on the poor, the working class, children, people with disabilities, domestic workers in the country, rent payers, precarious workers, informal traders, who particularly are women in this country, and of course, asylum seekers, the unemployed, and other vulnerable members of our society. And really, this speaks to just the intersectional approach that I suppose we should all be looking at when we're thinking around the impacts of COVID-19. So in South Africa, there was a movement that started out at the beginning of lockdown called South Africa First. And this really was a movement that was saying that the government of South Africa should prioritize South Africans ahead of any other nationality in the country. And this was speaking particularly to our African foreign nationals, your asylum seekers and refugees in the country. And so when you're thinking around the impact this would have on an ordinary South African woman, if you add then a migrant woman, you add that she's, you know, she's a precarious worker, she's an informal trader, you can imagine kind of her predicament in this situation compared to even the rest of other women in the country. So I think similarly, a gendered understanding or analysis of COVID-19 would have foreseen an increase in GBV in the homes of women who are locked in 24/7 with their abusers, and ensured that social services in the country were considered essential services and kept open. So what happened in the country is that a lot of lawyers, social workers, and other people who work in the human rights sector required permits in order to operate at the tighter and earlier lockdown restrictions. And so a number of social services were closed, and women could not get access to support services, have access to courts. And in many communities where there was heightened police and military visibility, women would be harassed on their way to try and access justice through police stations and courts. And of course, we know over the coming months, things opened up and women had to fight to access simple things like permits. But really what for me is really concerning is the fact that our politicians are sitting in these places of authority, and there's absolutely no imagining or thinking or foresight about the fact that courts, police stations, social workers are essential services during a crisis like this. And this really, for me, brings the issue around women's participation in some of the decision making, which of course are some of the the asks of 1325. But I think for us, it's important not only to think of women participating, but really also women interacting with policies and decisions such as these on an equal footing. So for me, it's about really moving from an issue of participation to an issue of parity. But for me, what are the opportunities that I do realize, and now I've painted a pretty gloomy picture of what the COVID-19 COVID-19 experience has impacted on women and I suppose gender equality more broadly. But I think one of the opportunities that have existed is really a new way of mobilizing and coordination that we've seen among civil society. This we've seen in the form of the C19 People's Coalition, which emerged at the start of the lockdown in South Africa. And this really is an alliance of social movements, trade unions, community-based organizations, NGOs that are united in a struggle for a just and effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And really just pushing for equitable and just and fair responses to COVID-19. So for me, I think even when we're thinking around Resolution 1325 and the fact that South Africa has a draft national action plan that is still sitting before cabinet, has not been launched formally, what I think COVID-19 has also brought is that we've focused all our attention and our resources on this pandemic and have in some respects kind of tossed and pushed the issue of gender equality by the wayside. Because if it wasn't, I would argue, if it wasn't for COVID-19, I would like to believe that the National Action Plan would have been launched and implemented, would be way on our way to implementing it. But again, women's issues have become, I suppose, secondary considerations, and other things have become the priority. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there and I'll leave the rest for maybe the Q&A and discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Noma. Really, really interesting and brilliant to hear of your experiences there. And just what I was thinking, particularly when you were talking about the minister not being able to foresee the impact, the economic impact on people, I definitely found some similar frustrations in Northern Ireland with that, particularly coming from Westminster. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, at one point when we were talking about asylum seekers in particular who have no recourse to public funds, when we talked about the immense struggles that they were facing, his response was, well, why don't they just apply for welfare? Well, your government was the one that blocks them from doing that, so that's why. And we've seen that with other issues too. I was raising different issues with political parties within Northern Ireland about how inadequate the support was for families and how having to wait 5 weeks before you could get support was really harming families, particularly single mothers. 91% of single parents in Northern Ireland are women. And when I raised that, I got responses from senior ministers in Northern Ireland to say, oh, we reformed that a few years ago. And I had to respond and say, if you read past the first line of your website, you'll see that you did not reform it. And so we have our own politicians not understanding the legislation that they are putting onto people that is deeply impacting people in such a severe way, particularly in relation to poverty. So just some of the points that you did bring up, in general, we've seen some huge issues here in Northern Ireland. We've seen the racist application of policing, where Black Lives Matter protesters are still being actively convicted for attending a safe, socially distanced protest, while anti-mask protesters who attacked police in certain instances still have not had anything happen. We have seen last week 6 women were stabbed or assaulted by a guy in Belfast in a series of misogynistic hate crime. 2 weeks before that, we saw a trans woman attacked brutally in the city centre. And we've also seen other issues like perinatal mental health services don't exist here. We saw a young woman die recently after giving birth because there's no support in Northern Ireland. And again, the UK, if you're a Black woman, you're 5 times more likely to die while giving birth as well. You know, these are huge issues that have just been pushed down the priority list by politicians, where COVID is now being used as an excuse to prevent all other work from happening. And I definitely get the feeling that that is something happening globally. So I wonder, just before we're waiting on 2 of our other speakers to join us just in a few minutes time, they're having some issues with connectivity we have speakers coming from Uganda and Sri Lanka. So I just wanted to check if we could do a quick general discussion about what we have discussed so far. And first of all, Noma, if I could ask you about your experience in providing an input into the South African National Action Plan, and just if you'd have any recommendations for us here in Northern Ireland.
So, I mean, my role in the National Action Plan was around, so I was in the drafting committee. So we had a number of consultations, oh my goodness, even before I directly was involved in the NAP process. So this was spanning a period of about 10 years. What was interesting about the South African context is that what took us, I suppose, so long to actually get the ball rolling was this conversation around, well, do we need a national action plan in South Africa? We're not a country in conflict. This has nothing to do with us. But of course, we know that, 1325 is as much an issue in a country in conflict, in active conflict, as it is in a country that is not in active conflict. And certainly in a country like ours, with so many issues affecting women, from violence to other issues of participation, etc., it's that much more important. But also in terms of other foreign policy engagement, because what is also interesting about our NAP is that it's not only looking domestically, but it's also looking outwardly. So what happened is that we had a number of consultative engagements with women from all 9 provinces in South Africa, across various levels, civil society, kind of more CBOs, just ordinary women in all corners of the country. And these women were inputting on what are their priorities, what are some of the issues that they would like to see in the National Action Plan. And then these were put together by, again, women in their diversity. And this culminated then in this draft that we put together, that we then took back to women, presented it to them. They inputted it once more and then validated it. And that's why now it is before cabinet. And we're just waiting for the launch and the big celebration, I suppose, and most importantly, the implementation. But I think what is important for me, that I think is important, I suppose it's something that a number of countries don't do so well, is really the consultation. I think it's so important that ordinary women in the country are aware of this policy. And not only are they aware, that they actually own it, that they feel that they've inputted into it. Because I think often I've seen in other countries is that, these policies are drafted by elitist women who speak good English and who are articulate and who know 1325, but really the ordinary woman, actually, this means absolutely nothing to them. But I think more importantly than that, for me, it would be the implementation. I think that's where South Africa really, really struggles. I think we usually don't have a problem with drafting really beautiful documents, from our constitution to many other beautiful pieces of legislation. But I think really at the heart of it, I mean, a policy that is just written on paper means nothing without it actually being implemented. And I think that would be the challenge for us as soon as, the policy is adopted, would be then the implementation and the monitoring and evaluation, of course.
Thank you so much. I know we would completely agree. We do quite a lot of work about making all public consultations accessible to women. And one of the ones we've really struggled with recently is around hate crime. The consultation document alone was almost 400 pages long for reforming our hate crime legislation. So most of us who work in policy 24/7 really struggled. And I know for me, even before being in my role, 1325 was not something I would have been familiar with. So really solid advice. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to see if we have any questions just before our next speakers come in. So if anyone has any questions at all, can you either just raise your hand or post into the chat? Oh, here's Ruth as well.
Just while Ruth's getting settled, I would just like to add to what Noma said there about, you know, when you've got these fantastic looking policies on paper and then they don't actually get implemented at all, or at least in the way in which they're supposed to. I think that reflects, you know, a common experience for us, but also for many corners of the world. You know, you have these experts who are really good at making things look good rather than actually making them happen. And it comes down to, you know, who's in the room and who's not as well, because if you have the people who know they need to put the policies together to be inclusive, to be far reaching, to be, you know, just perfect, but then they don't actually follow it up, it comes down to they know that they should be doing it, they're just not willing to actually do it. And I think that's an age-old problem in Northern Ireland, like the knowledge that these are issues, but the political will is the thing that's missing. And if we could find something that could magic political will out of nowhere, I think we'd be on the pig's back, because that's what's missing. That's the magic ingredient. It's not the knowledge. There's mountains of knowledge out there, and there's plenty of people willing to give their views. What's missing is the will to follow up.
Could I just also come in on what Elaine is saying? It's also where people draw the boundaries. And you made the point, Rachel, earlier, that the Irish National Action Plan did incorporate issues from Northern Ireland as well, whereas the UK one doesn't. But actually, there's an ongoing deliberative assembly in the Republic of Ireland under Catherine Day as chair. And they haven't asked, as far as I know, they haven't asked any input from Northern Ireland, and it's on the position of women. So, so I actually think that we should be submission bombing them.
I agree, Evelyn. Let's talk afterwards about how we'll do that. So I think Patricia Mullen has her hand up to ask a question, and then we're going to go on to our next speaker, Ruth. Patricia.
Hi, Elaine, just following up on what you said, I'm a social sciences researcher. I graduated in 2015 with a distinction out of Ulster, and I've done my politics and philosophy down in Trinity about 20 years before that. And it's just what you're saying about the implementation. I find it very clear from the get-go that there is the vision of the policy statement and the policy document, and it promises everything after everything. And then there's the reality of the implementation. And I have always referred to it in my work as the implementation gap. And that is where we're in serious trouble of disillusioning people and people walking away from their vote, and particularly women. I mean, I was brought up by a very strong woman and an even stronger man. And they taught me one thing: you use your vote, you use your voice. And I think we need to there's an empowerment issue. And it's not about telling people, as you say, about confidence. They don't need confidence. I've worked with these people for years in those communities. They know exactly what they need. They need people to get out of their road and let them do the work that needs done. But they can't get their voice heard. You said they're listened to, but they may be listened to, but no woman is very rarely heard unless they go into politics. And even then, they're usually dismissed or fobbed off or ignored or laughed at or told to go and fetch a tea. I did my training with the BBC as a journalist years ago, and I did it about women in politics. And I talked to Jane Morris, and I talked to everybody from that level down. And it was the same story the whole way down, from a councillor who couldn't get childcare and go to the meetings, to an MLA who was being, who had to deal with people saying, make the tea, even though she was an elected representative, to an MP who couldn't become leader of the party because she was a woman. And that's the only reason. And now we have two women supposedly running the two main parties in Northern Ireland. And where's the change? And that's the question I would like people to answer. Where is the change?
Yeah.
Because it's getting to a terrible pitch where people are choosing between feeding their weans, clothing their weans, putting shoes on their weans' feet. And the only wean who's doing anything is a wee footballer over in England. fighting a campaign.
Yeah. I totally understand everything you're saying there. It rings true for me too. And in speaking about women being treated poorly in politics, I mean, we all know the disgraceful behavior that happened when the Women's Coalition were entering the first talks, you know, with being moved at and
I mean,
all of that.
I think everybody in this conversation knows that, but I need to know is what's gonna change for women.
Well, I think
what organizations are doing things that will change things for women? Because everyone here today knows these things and they've probably experienced these things. But how are we going to get those people who have those things as a lived experience, getting up there and saying to the politicians, now hang on a wee minute, boyo, what are you going to do for us today? That's what I need to know.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer just on my own, but what I will say is...
No, I'm not throwing it at you, I'm throwing it at everybody. How are we doing it? How are we going to do it?
Patricia, if it's all right, we can go to our next speaker, finish up the speaking in general, and we'll put it...
Sorry, I thought the speaking was finished. My apologies.
No, I'll put it to everyone at the panel then, if that's all right.
Oh yeah, sorry, Pat. I didn't realize that there was more speakers. Sorry.
No, you're okay. Yeah, so two of our speakers have joined a bit later, so we can come back to that at the end, Patricia. A really good question for everyone to consider. So I'm gonna just introduce our next speaker. So from Uganda, we have Ruth Ocheng, who is the Executive Director of ISIS Women's International Cross-Cultural Exchange, a Kampala-based women's resource center for women fleeing conflict. Ruth herself had experienced the trauma of conflict, having narrowly escaped during attacks on civilians in Uganda. The country endured a 20-year period of dictatorship and civil war, ending in 1986. Yet violence is still a fact of life in Uganda, as the government faces off against the rebel group, the Lord's Resistance Army, and civil wars in neighboring countries such as Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and as they spill across the border. Let me just see. And can I ask as well that everyone just puts themselves on mute? I think there's a bit of an echo. So Ruth uses her own experiences with trauma and violence to now help others. She has made it her mission to work with people who don't have the freedom or space to speak out about violence that they have faced. She found her platform in WICCE, which was founded in Geneva in 1974 as a resource centre for women who fled conflict from around the world. In 1993, the group moved its headquarters to Uganda to focus on its work on the root causes of what women were facing in their home countries. The group wanted to tap into African women's ideas and share them with the international community. So in the mid-1990s, Ruth and her team began to document the cases of violence in Uganda, including sexual violence. The organization brought in specialized teams of trained trauma consultants who worked directly with the group to provide holistic medical, psychological, and social support to the survivors of sexual violence in conflict that the group had identified. The treatment Ruth and her team provide for women enables them to return to their homes and communities and as critically important economic providers. Seeing women who were once victims now serving as leaders in their communities motivates Ruth to continue with this difficult work. Their documentation gathering and holistic treatment program has expanded globally, and similar programs have been successfully carried out in other post-conflict countries across the world. Ruth also promotes women's leadership capacity by leading training programs for women and activists. And Ruth says that this type of holistic treatment for women survivors of violence is key to building truly peaceful societies. And to quote Ruth, she says, there will be no fundamental transformation of post-conflict societies unless the woman's body, mind, and spirit has been healed. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ruth to speak to all of you. So Ruth, are you able to come in okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Rachel. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so delighted that I've had an opportunity to talk to women who have the same thinking like me. And Rachel, I remember you did say I should talk about women fleeing conflict in Uganda. And from what you have already said, it says exactly what we did. So what I've decided was probably just to give you an anecdote of the conflicts in Uganda, because I know not very many people know about that. And then after that, focus on this fleeing woman. What is it that she finds on the way, wherever she goes? What are the empowerments she has? And what are the continuous violations that she experiences? For those who don't know Uganda very well, Uganda got its independence from Britain in 1962. And after just 2 years, we started having internal conflicts. We had the 1966 Uganda conflict. This is one where one of the largest ethnic group went into a clash with the government, or the then government. Then from there, 1977, the first president elected by the vote was thrown out of government. Then in 1979, the guy who overthrew the first president, that was Idi Amin, was also thrown out. And those are all, conflicts that women had to go through. In 1985, he was also thrown out by now another group that came from Tanzania, but Tanzania was just helping us to make sure that Idi Amin gets out of the conflict of Uganda. But the one which is known globally is the 1986 up to 2006. That is the conflict that really took place mostly in northern Uganda between the present government and the communities in northern Uganda, with the pretext that the northern Uganda community were fighting government. This is one conflict that I have lived to see when I'm an adult. And of course, when we come to talk about what the women went through, we need to go back to what society thinks. And I think Patricia was asking, why is it that women go up there and still don't make any difference to women's lives? In my society, Uganda, we have a way society, of course, the male patriarchy define women. And we even have proverbs of how they refer to a woman. A woman can be referred to as, it's a property. And the word they use is not property, but they use a word like, she's a prostitute. She's born here, but she will go and get married somewhere else. So how do you even trust her? Some of them say women are rumor mongers. So nobody wants to give any information to the women. And when conflict comes, that is when you find that the conflict arrives when these women don't even know that men are organizing to fight. They don't give her information because they think she's a rumor monger. And as such, the war finds this woman so uninformed that when they start hitting the bullets, the bombs, she ends up in this catch-22 of her role as a nurturer, and then how do I run away? So in reality, we have seen women who don't even think about themselves, but they start mobilizing the whole household. She has the children, she has the elderly, and she has to carry some little food so that she can give the children and the elder and whoever as she continues running. And most of them don't run outside Uganda. They will run from one district to another. And as they run, they are faced with so many problems. But the first thing she's thinking about is, how do I make my family survive? So she goes on looking for any type of labor. And within looking for labor, that's when some of them are violated. Others you find they are cracking stones because stones are used to construct. Then the whole stones come and fall on them. Some died during that kind of work. So you find that at the end of the day, as she continues to find where to have refuge, she is just going through a lot of violations. So what we found some of them to do is that she has no option. By the way, majority of people who experience this are people who are the poor of the poorest. So they don't even have the money. So it reaches a time if she falls into some of the perpetrators, they tell her, join us. And because she wants to be protected, she joins the rebels or any other person. And within that joining, there are mods and so many atrocities that happens to her. I remember talking to so many of them that I thought I would be protected, but I ended up being a sex slave. She couldn't even tell how many soldiers came to sleep with her in a day. So within that time, by the way, sometimes she's even having a baby with her. She's carrying a gun, but then her sexuality makes sure that all those hooligans are happy as they say so. So at the end of the day, when she gets sickness of maybe syphilis, gonorrhea, there's no services that she'll get. She continues moving with this kind of pains as they continue fighting. And they went on and on like that. Then you get the whole lot of those who now could not stand it anymore and cross the border to Rwanda, to DRC, or to South Sudan. And there again, it is another bunch of violations. Now she even has these traumas that she doesn't know where her siblings or her children went in case they are attacked. One story I will never forget is this young woman who had a child, and when they were attacked, one of the soldiers who had pregnanted her tells her, kill that child, kill that child. And she said, how would I? But the man turned and shot the child, and they moved on anyway. By the time she came back home, the only thing she did was to commit suicide. She died. But let's talk about those who remain, who don't go into, they flee within Uganda, one district to another. Theirs is even worse because other than sexually being abused, they are tortured so much with plastic, boiling plastic plates, which are put in fire so that they get some information from them. They are systematically raped as they continue moving from one place to another. And most of them, and in Uganda, it was very clear, where the war passed is where the HIV was very, very high. And mind you, when all that has come, and I'm just coming to conclude so that we can have time to talk, when all that happens and the men, and that's why I want to emphasize the issue of Patricia, saying that what happens to women who have had all these things when they get to power, why don't they see these issues as critical issues? Because when men get the power and money, all these things remain a problem of women. In Uganda here, we have never had any reconciliation. We have done nothing. These women are still continuing with the pain that they had. And all this, for me, I have seen them evolve when COVID came in. Because as COVID has come in, we have seen our participation is zero. The government decided to militarize even the COVID because whoever distributed the little food that was around was military. So we have seen a high level of GBV, domestic violence, homicide, and children. The thing which pains me so much is when the lockdown came, all the children stayed at home. There is nothing they were doing. The vulnerability was high. And as I speak in my village, there are 300 pregnant girls between the age of 12 and 15. And this is something I'm sharing with the women of the world. Sincerely, for how long is this going to continue? We have been calling the gun to be the military, but COVID also is militarized. It is another war that we need to fight. No woman in our who are members of parliament, whom I have even seen government saying, why do you not mobilize civil society? And we see how we can reach the poor of the poorest. Everything is patriarchal. Everything has gone back to exactly when we are at war. And my conclusion as I close is, when we say peace and security, what do we mean? When we fought so hard in 2000 to put up the UN Security Resolution 1325, we had a reason. We knew we were going to be at the center of participation. And Patricia, to tell you the truth, those women in parliament can't say nothing. The system coerces them and gags them as far as Uganda is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ruth, and incredibly harrowing. And really, to me, it just shows us the importance of ensuring that all the pillars of 1325 are implemented, because it just shows why this was done in the first place, and to see the deep issues remain within Uganda, not only in women's participation, but in protection as well. It's just absolutely horrific. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I hope we can discuss a bit more at the end about this global perspective and what it means for all of us ahead of the anniversary. So I'm gonna just go to our last speaker before we open up again to a panel discussion, if that's okay. So our next speaker, let me just find it. Yes, so our next speaker, providing the Sri Lankan perspective, is Ambika, who is an Open Society Fellow, and from October 2015 to March 2020, she was the Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Prior to that, for 8 years, she functioned as the legal consultant to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sri Lanka. Her research, advocacy, and activism have focused on transitional justice, custodial violence, prison reform, militarization, gender, and Tamil nationalism. Her publications include contributions to the Oxford Handbook of Gender and Conflict, the Routledge Handbook on Human Rights in South Asia, and Contemporary South Asia. She is chairperson of an Indigenous Sri Lankan grant-making organisation and vice chairperson of Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific, a regional feminist grant-making organisation. Ambika also holds a Master of Laws in Human Rights degree from University of Nottingham, where she was a scholar, and has earned her bachelor's degree from Monash University, Australia. So I'd like to hand over to Ambika, who's going to give us a bit of information on the current situation in Sri Lanka, what this means for women's participation, and how COVID has really worsened this as well. So over to you, Ambika.
Thank you, Rachel. I think just, hearing the last speaker, I was just struck by how many similarities there are in our situations. So I'm just going to first look at, go by your theme and look at how COVID has impacted social justice and then also gender equality, because I think gender issues cannot be looked at in a silo, disconnected from the larger structural systemic inequalities. So I think that is what also the pandemic has driven home to us here, to show how deeply people are connected, but also how they are far apart. Because in Sri Lanka, and I think in much of the world, we've had to deal with the pandemic in a world in which populist and authoritarian governments were increasing. We have that here. And we've also seen a resurgence of ethno-nationalism and identity politics. So what we're seeing now in Sri Lanka post-November 2019, when we also had a repressive government come back into power, is that reversal of gains made in the protection of human rights, increased militarization, and also increasing influence of religious groups. on government and governance. So this has only served to marginalize already disadvantaged groups. So we've seen COVID affect plantation workers, daily wage earners, people in the informal sector, small home-based businesses. So these people have lost their livelihoods, sometimes overnight. And I think that once again illustrates the larger inequalities in the labor market in relation to I think it shows that we've also failed to protect labor rights. So we've seen an exacerbation of poverty and a limit that these communities, marginalized communities, have actually been pushed further into poverty. We've also seen that the historical, in a way, the failure to adequately invest in social services and social protection mechanisms have been forgotten. And what we've seen, and I think also maybe globally, what we've seen is that we've had these huge donations from the millionaires and the billionaires, and I know to the COVID effect, to the COVID impact, trying to counter the impact of COVID. And that has also been celebrated both by the state and even by the population, who don't seem to ask, why is our hospital, why are our hospitals so underfunded, or why don't we have urgent healthcare facilities? Why don't we have enough ventilators? And instead, these philanthropists are celebrated. So although it illustrates the structural and systemic inequalities, we find that they're not being addressed. We've also, what we've seen is that I think in the past decade we have been told that technology and technology-based social entrepreneurship is like the solution to all the social problems of our time. But I think what we have seen here is that when you have wealth creation in a dysfunctional system, without a value base that is founded on equality, equity, and non-discrimination, it only deepens existing inequality. Because in Sri Lanka, we also have a society that functions on patronage, and we do have certain feudal tendencies and entrenched hierarchies based on race, ethnicity, and religion. So the pandemic has once again highlighted the divide, because everyone goes digital, but you have kids who don't have a computer, who don't have internet connection, and therefore they cannot access schooling. People who don't have credit cards can't order goods online. So when you go into lockdown for a week, complete curfew, how do they go out and buy provisions? And they're daily wage earners. So if they can't go out and earn a daily wage, that means they cannot put food on their table that day. So there are large communities that were adversely impacted in this manner. But also what we have seen is that we've seen furtherance of ethno-nationalist politics, because we've had in Sri Lanka, communities historically have been subjected to incitement to hatred, vitriol, violence. Historically, it's mainly been the Tamils who have been subject to this, with intermittent targeting of Muslims as well. And currently, of course, the Muslims are the main target. So during COVID, we have seen this stigmatization and scapegoating of Muslims. It has taken many forms through social media, mainstream media. They are blamed for the spread of COVID. You find that the Muslim community is being denied the right to bury persons who die of COVID and are being forced to cremate them. And at this time, you find the state has taken little action to stem or counter it, and in some ways, it's enabling it. The other main thing we've seen during COVID, and I think it's in a way a continuation of pre-COVID factors as well, is authoritarianism and entrenchment of militarization. We find that since the old repressive government we had that came back into power in November 2009, the powers of the executive have expanded. You find what we call rule by task force. So the president uses broad powers to establish ad hoc bodies with membership of the military, even businessmen and Buddhist clergy, and they're given wide powers, which also impinge upon powers of existing state structures. And what actually today is a kind of a a very important day, because today in Parliament, I mean, maybe they've already voted now. They were voting 20th Amendment to our Constitution, and what it does, it undermines democracy, undermines powers of the Parliament, it consolidates power in the President, and it also does away with independent commissions. So if it is passed, and we think it will be passed, I think we're in for very difficult times, because freedom of expression, freedom of association, everything can be impacted, because the government and all the power will be centered in one individual, the president. Now, the other factor of militarization. And we saw that after the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka in 2009, there was systematic militarization. The military was engaging in activity, charity, you name it. This was somewhat in 2009 when we had quite a progressive government come into power, but it was never dismantled. And because it was never dismantled, what we saw in November 2009 is that when the old regime came back into power, rapid militarization. So even the response to COVID has been militarized. We have the commander of the army who is heading the National Operations Center, and we have the military running quarantine camps. It's the army commander who is making statements. It doesn't look like the health sector is actually leading it. The statements made by the health sector contradict what the police and the military are saying. And there are also attempts to crack down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression as well. We also see an increasing use of war metaphors to describe the so, it's like a battle. The military has stepped up to combat. The military has to fight with the enemy that will destroy the entire nation. So, the war metaphors are used to create fear of the enemy, and then the state comes in and the state will protect all of you. But what has happened, we a recent outbreak, and it seems like we have had community spread for a very long time. The spike cases over the past week, we've had like a 3,000 spike in cases, 3,000 new cases. It appears they're losing control of the response. And we've had free trade zone workers, once again, a very because it started off, it was identified, the new cases were identified in trade zone factory, and most of the work, and the response to this has been a militarized response, where there are allegations that the women were just corralled in buses and taken to quarantine centers that with very unhygienic conditions, and the women were were not given any information, and they were treated with little dignity or respect. So this whole militarized response is unraveling now. But at the same time, we find that the state is actually not giving information to the population. So we also don't know what exactly is happening. So the militarized response, as I said before, it is unraveling, and it has shown exactly why the health sector should be at the forefront of this response. So if we come to gender equality and women's participation, I mean, like in many countries, we have a very patriarchal society, very misogynist society. Inequality is, there is deep-seated inequality. We had the first prime minister in the world, we've had a woman president, but which did nothing to dismantle the systemic and structural inequalities, because these women were also from political families, they were privileged women, and hence our systems are structured, our structures, are not conducive to women's participation, particularly women's political participation. So war affected women, but already due to as well as militarization, the conflict affected areas. We have a large number of women-headed households dependent on daily wage labor, or they have home-based businesses. So due to COVID, due to the lockdown, these persons have been severely affected. So in the context of negligible state assistance, these women are more vulnerable. They are pushed further into poverty, they can be subject to exploitation, and they're also pushed into dangerous professions. We have seen during COVID, we've seen an increase in violence against women, and many women have also been unable to leave their home and seek help because of the lockdown or the curfew. At the same time, it has also been difficult for the service providers to be active and to be responsive and to reach out to these women, once again, due to these health regulations or to the lockdowns. Now, for instance, in the plantation sector consists of persons who were brought into Sri Lanka from South India as indentured labor to work in the plantations, about, I think, like 100 years ago. And so these people have their economic situation, socioeconomic situation has really changed much in these years. And what we have seen during COVID is also a rise in teenage babies. There have also been instances where women have had babies and they didn't know what to do with them, and it was babies out of wedlock. And there were also, I think, 3 cases where the women killed the babies and then they were arrested and they were remanded. So increased violence. And also women's participation in politics public really hasn't changed much during COVID, because it's just as bad as it was. And I give a quote, use a quote by a woman politician, a parliamentarian who's actually a friend, today posted on her Instagram about the parliamentary debate yesterday about the 20th Amendment to our Constitution. And she says, times the debate descended to the level of a bunch of boys trying to be macho, hurling insults at each other across the aisle, talking utter rubbish. All this while laughing and smiling and calling each other my close friend. So I think that sums up the entire atmosphere in Parliament, and I think that illustrates a context in which it would actually be very difficult for women also to engage and to have their voices heard. We've also seen a rise in cyberbullying, particularly, I think, in the past few months during COVID, cyberbullying, fake news, gendered hate speech, all that. We've kind of seen a spike in that. And I think what COVID has shown women activists in particular, because women are always trying to take care of others, and even the women activists, taking care of others, and particularly in very difficult circumstances, I think it's questions about, do we actually take care of ourselves? And the importance of self-care, and we need to ensure that there is care in order for us to be effective when we respond and we help the communities, because I think sometimes we think that activists and defenders are invincible. I think who needs that is also something to pay attention to, particularly during the pandemic. Brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ambika. It just cut out a little bit at the end there, but really, really striking stuff. And I really appreciate you taking the time to give us the global perspective on what's going on in Sri Lanka. And one of the most common themes that I've really seen across all of our speakers is that there has been a real failure to deal with the past in all of the areas that have been described today. And just having women in positions of leadership, that's not empowerment if the women are going to uphold systemic structures that oppress the most marginalized groups. And it seems to have been a theme for all of us. And I have again noted just some of the things I took down that was common across different groups was ethno-nationalist division. In Northern Ireland alone this week, there was a lot of ridiculous comments around Catholics and nationalists spreading COVID, which were simply not true. What we found was poverty is areas where COVID is highest because people are working in unsafe conditions and have no other choice but to do so. And again, the violence against women, another stark issue that was present across all of these areas. And I know in Northern Ireland, more women were murdered in the first month than they were of all of last year by their partners. And we're now under our second lockdown, so we're extremely concerned. And again, the poverty, service providers, underfunding of health, just common themes across all of these areas. And I have seen a few different questions come in, but before we go to them, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our speakers for giving us this really unique opportunity to hear what's happening globally. And only for Zoom right now, we wouldn't be able to be doing this call across 3 or 4 different continents right now. So I'm going to ask if our speakers could all unmute themselves and, if possible, show your video. So Noma and Ruth, if you're able to unmute yourselves as well for the discussion, but I'll read out some of the questions that we have here. So first of all, I have a question from Caroline Smith for Ruth, and she is asking, oh, sorry, it's for Ambika. What are the conditions in quarantine camps? How many people can be there, and are they having medical care?
Well, we actually don't know, because that if you come from abroad and you need to be quarantined, you can actually do it in a hotel, a 4-star hotel, a 5-star hotel. That is if you can afford it. But if not, then you're taken to a quarantine camp. But they're all run by military, because even the hotels, it's the military that's running it. And we've had accounts of the people in the hotel saying the conditions were like not bad, to accounts of the free trade zone workers recently, but they released a video where conditions were just appalling. And they were actually saying, by being in this with like so many hundreds of people together, even if we didn't have COVID, we could probably get it from someone else. And the conditions were so unhygienic. They are supposed care, but we've also had incidents, like one instance of a person who they say died, while he was in the quarantine camp, and it wasn't clear whether they didn't take him out to the hospital on time. So, it's really not clear, also because the military is running it and there is no independent access to it. The Human Rights Commission should be able to visit it. They have access, but I don't think they have.
Thank you, Ambika. And some worrying similarities to not quarantine camps, but the direct provision centres on this island, where asylum seekers are being kept in extremely dangerous conditions without adequate safety or support measures. And tragically, a woman had died recently in one of the direct provision centres from being malnourished. And again, unsafe working conditions. We're seeing people in meat factories and other areas being denied basic safety. I want to ask another question from Caroline Smith. This one is for Ruth. So Caroline has asked, Ruth, is there much treatment for HIV and other STDs to the women in your village and in Uganda in general?
Before lockdown, we definitely knew that most of people living positive could access the drugs. But when lockdown came, that's where the challenge has been, because most times the drugs would be in urban centers and very minimal in those small units in villages, because we don't have the appropriate healthy workers to explain to them how to take the drugs. I recall there is a time, I think that was in April, when there was a lot of outcry by people living positive with HIV and AIDS, saying they have jumped, they are taking drugs because they cannot access them, because they don't have anybody to go and pick the drugs for them. So to answer your question, is a yes and no. There are those who are in communities, since the lockdown has been eased a bit, they can access. But for those in deep rural communities, they are having a hard time to continue on their drug, because they don't get it as often as they are supposed to.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think that really touches on something that was raised by everyone as well, is how unequal things have been distributed in each country and the division. So I wonder, Noma, if you want to comment at all. I know you mentioned around how unequal South Africa is after Brazil. Has there been any notable difference in increasing the inequalities in South Africa?
No, certainly. I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think what COVID-19 has done is just to bring it to the fore and to really entrench it and perhaps put it in our faces in ways that perhaps we had not seen before. Just some anecdotal experience to share with you. Here in Cape Town, where I'm based, I was having a conversation not too long ago with a colleague who's actually working in the Cape Flats. And if any of you know a little bit about the history of South Africa, or maybe how the history has really played away, has sort of brought a lot of ugly things in terms of our present, there's an issue of gangsterism in Cape Town. And so what our government has done, they've placed a number of the military, as of, I think it was, if not early this year, it must have been late last year, actually, yes. It must have been early last year, they deployed military into our communities to kind of curb the gangsterism and, of course, the drugs that accompany it. And one of the women that a colleague of mine had been working with in the community mentioned that during lockdown, what has happened is that obviously, you know, some of the drug dealers and the the head of the gangsters are now at home and are unable to operate as well as they should. So of course they would then, you know, the woman is the one who will bear, I guess, the frustration and the suffering that this man is facing. And so what happened is that these men would then force the wives or the girlfriends to go out, if they're drug abusers, to go out and look for drugs, as well as look for food, and then they must come back and make a plan for them. So one of the women who was experiencing this came to one of the food distribution centers that a colleague of mine was running, and she brought her children and she said, can I give up my children for adoption because I don't know what to do anymore? They have not eaten in X amount of days. I'm expected to do all these things. It's just so overwhelming. And then another woman was, this colleague was telling me, was actually seated. So I think the food distribution would start around 4 p.m. And so this woman would come to the site as early as like 9 a.m. and she'll sit on the curb from like 9 a.m. all the way till like sunset. And so this woman was asking her, the food will only be distributed late in the afternoon. You're aware of this. What are you still doing there? And this woman said that, you know, it's just unsafe for me to be at home. I don't have food at home. I feel like I have nothing to do at home. I'm just sitting here hoping that maybe something will change. And so that's really just reveals just a snippet of how bad things have become for many, many women and many other people in the country, as far as accessing basic things like food, water, shelter, you know, jobs. You know, the informal sector has been most hard hit by the pandemic. A lot of women who were informal traders, you know, their source of livelihood has been completely shattered. So yes, certainly I think this pandemic has reared its ugly head and showed us how bad the inequalities are in the country and how much work really needs to be done. And of course, we see as well that those that are in the tech sector, you know, I suppose the rich get richer, right? And the poor get poorer. And I think that's the case here in South Africa. Those who are already making money in terms of their businesses, perhaps in the tech and in certain areas are killing it, while the rest are wallowing in poverty.
Thank you, Noma. So we have another question in the group, and then I'll open it up again for maybe one or two more before we finish up. So this question is from Patricia, and it's a question open to all. So whoever would like to answer, please feel free. So she has asked, do you believe the changes in traditional housing models across Ireland, and then, for example, 3 generations in one household, shared resources to a rise in single-person households amongst the young and old, has contributed to greater poverty or growing inequality or mental health? So I'll open that up maybe to Avila and Elaine first and see if there are any similar experiences elsewhere.
Okay, well, I grew up in a 3 generational household, so I have some direct experience with that. I think there's pros and cons. I think in certain situations, it can certainly help in terms of the sharing of resources and certainly the sharing of care, where you have a number of different generations. And I started my community work in Derry, where actually in the 70s, it was very normal for grandchildren to be actually brought up by grandparents, or indeed by aunts, by other members of extended families. Less so now. So I suppose that's the benefit. There isn't the same level of isolation that you would get in single person households. The downside is that intergenerational households can be very restrictive, particularly in terms of attitudes to women and women's position. I always remember my grandmother sort of telling me, when I went to university and I was the first person in my family to go, not to get a very good degree because it would put the boys off and I probably wouldn't get married. So there are some downsides to intergenerational households as well. Thanks,
Avila.
Just to pick up on what Avila said, for a period I also grew up in a three generation household until my granddad passed away, but I wouldn't say it was especially advantageous in the sense that it can push, because the reason that it became a three generational household was because of the illness of the older member. And, it can kind of push younger people who aren't ready for caring roles into caring roles. If the parents are out working, it wasn't necessarily, my own experience, but it can work both directions, and, can lead to children leaving school before they're ready to look after elderly grandparents who maybe aren't in the best of health. In terms of mental health, like Avila said, it can cut both directions. Certainly it can address loneliness, though, in a way that our current situation doesn't really facilitate, because some of the women that I work with and speak with talk a lot about isolation, and they used to know everyone on the street. They used to have people, they'd leave their front doors open, people would be in and out. This kind of community thing that they feel has dissipated. But I don't think that's related entirely just to the models of living. I think that also has to do with things like immigration and not migration in here, but emigration out of here. Because one of the major problems Northern Ireland has is a brain drain, as they call it in the broadsheet newspapers, but really what it is people losing their faith in this place and whether it will ever get better, and seeing opportunities elsewhere and leaving. And that can be entire families, or can be just young people who, they go to England for university and then they just never come back. It gets worse at times of financial strain. It gets worse whenever there's a feeling, every so often you see these conversations bubbling up when there's a feeling that our politicians are exploiting the ethno-national conflict, like happened just this week around COVID. But it's back to what I was talking about before, that long shadow of the past, that people feel like the only way to escape it is to physically escape. So I know it's slightly off topic to the question, but I think that's one of the reasons that you see less family structure than you would previously have had, is people leaving.
Thanks, Elaine. And one of the issues that we found anyway when doing our research for the Feminist Recovery Plan was families that don't necessarily live together but rely on that intergenerational support for childcare, elder care, other issues, and not being able to do that anymore had a huge impact on women and their ability to work, and even their ability to work from home for some. So many examples of women trying to manage homeschooling. Some of their kids were being taught in different languages from they were, the digital divide, and having to manage an unequal distribution of work in the household. It's just another example of some of these barriers. So before I open up again, I wonder, Ambika, Noma and Ruth, do any of you have any comments at all on that last part?
Yes, I think when Avila was speaking, it looked like she was speaking about our communities here. Of course, sometime in the 60s and 70s, we used to live in a communion, and you found that families were support system to one another. Even if mothers went to gardening, there was a grandmother, there was a grandfather who cared for these other challenges that women now face, and using just their own hands without any support system. And we grew up knowing that if you had any problem, the structures were very clear. So the mental well-being was also well nurtured because there was an elder who would talk to young people and whom they trusted and would counsel quite a number of us at very tender age, so that whatever was bothering you, you get rid of it because someone has affirmed and confirmed to you that this is just a wave, it will come and go. And of course, now you look at young ladies, they have children, they are staying in a flat, they have disconnected, of course, from the society back in villages because nobody now comes to them. She really faces a huge challenge of caring for children, balancing it with her own work. And quite a number of girls have just said, I can't stand this marriage, I'm out. And we see quite a number of domestic violence also. And when you listen to the causes of the violation, there are things which I would believe if there was that support system, they would get through them. But now we lack that. And of course, when we talk about psychologists, how many are there who will go all over Uganda to counsel women and young people who are having huge challenges? Challenges like throwing you out of the land you have lived, your grandfather lived there, then some rich guy comes and talks the system, who says he wants to invest. And you see very many people losing their own value called land. And I never used to see people on the streets of Kampala, but now I see them in numbers. So I think it is both ways. I also agree to that. It used to support, but things have changed, and the older people have also evolved, and some are not there. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge, and it's bringing a lot of mental health to young women, especially.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Before I go on to Noma and Ambika, just conscious of time. So if you have any comments on that, or if you want to just give a closing comment as well, just before we finish up. And before we do finish, could I ask that as many people as possible put their camera on? I would love to get a photo from today's webinar. I know people are sick of Zoom, but if we could do that as well, that would be great. So I'll go to, where am I? I'll go to Ambika and then Noma.
Well, I think in Sri Lanka, particularly in the conflict-affected areas, we're seeing a lot of social change because many of these communities were completely cut off from the world until the end of the war. So the young people didn't even have access to internet or mobile phones and things like that. So there is a lot of social change, and there is unemployment. So you see the young men engaging in violence. There seems to be gang violence. There's also the military or the intelligence services trying to infiltrate and bring about social, shall we say, instability, and also the gender relations. I think during the war, actually, it opened up space for women to be more active, and women also participated in the war as combatants. But what we have seen post-war is a reversal, and a really kind of rapid reversal and a very disturbing reversal. Like, for instance, dowries. And you find even within society, women are expected to adhere to very conservative norms again. I mean, not that they weren't before, but now it's worse than ever. So I think we've seen regression. So we also see a lot of generational, intergenerational conflict, a lack of understanding. So I think, like any post-war society, the northern and eastern societies are also falling apart. The question is, what do we do to rebuild them? So I think for us, that's a huge challenge ahead.
Thank you very much, Ambika. And Noma, do you have any final comments at all before we take our group pick?
Yes, just something very small. As I think about just many other global health pandemics that we've had in the world, and I'm thinking of Ebola right now, I feel like what happens with any emergency, and certainly with health emergencies, that there's a lot of lessons that we ought to be learning. And when I think of Ebola, particularly as it had impacted on West Africa most harshly, I think there are always so many lessons that we can learn, especially in terms of its effects on women and how women can emerge and try and find solutions to problems, and also just highlight the impact of such pandemics. So I think it would be important for us as well in this moment to really document some of the challenges as a way to learn, so that in the future we may know how to respond in ways that would best, benefit women, so that when we're hit by another crisis, we're not scrambling. We know that this is how we respond. Yeah.
Thank you, Noma. And I think that's probably one of our biggest takeaways from the Feminist Recovery Plan too, is, this is how you should respond. This is how you should take inequalities into account in any future crisis. And this is how you can alleviate them as well. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to take a quick group pick here. Oh, Darvla. So if you could all smile, and Ruth's camera's on now too. Great. So 3, 2, 1. And let me just take one on my phone to be sure. 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So yeah, lots of nice comments as well in the group chat, just thanking everyone for providing your different perspectives. To me personally, it was an incredibly inspiring event. And it's also really useful, I think, to look in at other places across the world and see what is happening, and seeing the similarities, but also what we can learn from each other. So I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Women's Resource and Development Agency and also the Women's Policy Group. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, the wonderful Avila and Elaine, giving the Northern Ireland perspective, to Ambika for describing the situation in Sri Lanka and providing her expertise, to Noma for also giving us such a useful input into what's happening in South Africa, and to Ruth for a truly touching and incredible description of what's going on as well in Uganda. Really appreciate it today. And I'd also like to thank the Social Change Initiative for co-hosting this event, and particular shout out to Avila with her worldwide connections who made this possible today. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone. A recording of this webinar will go onto our website, so I will send a link around to all participants, and I'm also going to send a really short survey just to give us a few thoughts on what you thought of today's session. So thank you so much, everyone, and stay safe and good luck with everything going on wherever you are right now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.